Okay, so we're going to do the cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord at this point. So we'll start with this model. This is a beautiful model where you can see the spinal cord inside a cervical vertebra. And we know it's a cervical vertebra because we have this bifid spinous process. And you can also see the transverse foramina here. And you can see why they are there, because there's an artery and some veins that go through there. Okay, you can also see all of the meninges here, which is really, really nice. Okay, so we'll start with the meninges. Okay, so we're in this space first. Okay, this is the epidural space. You can see some of it here. You can also see some of it here. Okay, the darker gray that you see in both of these places is the periosteum of the vertebra. Okay, now the epidural space is filled with adipose tissue, so that's what this kind of yellowish material represents. And this is a buffer that you have between the meninges and the bone. Because the vertebrae move quite a bit, the meninges cannot be attached to the vertebrae, otherwise they'd get torn. Okay, so we have this buffer tissue, this nice fat, the padding in there, our bubble wrap to protect the cord, keep it in its position, and let the bones move around it without damaging it. Okay, so once we get past the adipose tissue, we get to the spinal dura mater. Okay, this is the most superficial layer of our meninges. It's also the toughest layer, dense regular connective tissue. We go past this little gap and we get to the arachnoid. Okay, and the arachnoid has two parts. It has that membranous part that is attached to the dura, and then, not really well shown here, it also has that filamentous or web-like part. So that web-like material would be extending through this space. And this space that you see completely around the spinal cord is the subarachnoid space. And this is the space, as I said, where you have the webbing of the arachnoid, and in between the little pieces of webbing, this is where you have your cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so this is the fluid that supports the weight of the brain and the spinal cord and protects them both from injury. Okay, as we get to the surface of the spinal cord, we have the pia mater. Okay, and you can see how that covers the surface and even extends into indentations in the surface that are present. We'll see that in the brain as well. Okay, and then we get to the spinal cord itself. Okay, so the spinal cord is organized into sections of white matter that are superficial and deeper sections of gray matter, which are shown in this kind of tan color here. The white matter is white because it's composed of myelinated axons. Remember when we looked at the models of the neuron, that the myelin was made up of the membrane, the plasma membrane of Schwann cells. And plasma membranes are mostly fat. Okay, remember they're mostly phospholipids. Okay, and if you think of a piece of steak, how that fat is white, okay, that's why the white matter is white. It's all that myelin, which is basically all lipid or mostly lipid. Okay, so white matter, myelinated axons. Another name for axons would be nerve fibers. And we can divide that white matter up into funiculi. We have the posterior funiculus or dorsal funiculus here, one on each side. We have the lateral funiculus here and here. And then we have the ventral or anterior funiculus on each side here. Okay, the gray matter is organized into subdivisions called horns. Okay, since we're at cervical levels, we only have 2 of the horns here. The dorsal or posterior horn. You can always tell the posterior horn because that's the one that seems to touch the surface of the cord. Okay, so there's one on each side. And then this larger section here is the anterior or ventral horn. Okay, there's no lateral horn on this particular model because lateral horns are only found at thoracic and upper lumbar sections of the spinal cord. Okay, so even though it looks like there's a couple of subdivisions here, this is all ventral horn, both sides. You can see that the gray matter connects as you go from one side to the other. This is the gray commissure. Okay, and there's a little opening in here. That is the central canal. Okay, now as we look out away from the spinal cord, you can see that there are little structures attached to the spinal cord. These are the passageways that allow impulses to enter and leave the spinal cord. Okay, so we have a set of roots that are attached to the spinal cord. The ones attached to the posterior side are the dorsal roots. Okay, and this side it's kind of covered up with connective tissue sheath. Over here it's uncovered. Okay, so these are the dorsal rootlets combining to form the dorsal root, and you can always tell the dorsal root because it has that swelling in it, the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, the other root is the ventral root. Here's the rootlets coming together to form the ventral root. Okay, now the dorsal root and the ventral root have axons that are carrying just a single type of information in each of them. Okay, if you're an impulse that's going through an axon in the dorsal root, you have to be sensory information coming into the spinal cord. That's the only type of information that passes through these axons. If you're an impulse going through the ventral root, you are an impulse coming from the spinal cord going out to an effector. So we would consider that a motor impulse. Okay, so all the impulses passing through the dorsal root are associated with sensory function. All of the impulses passing through the ventral root are associated with motor function. Okay, now the 2 roots come together in the intervertebral foramen to form a single structure called the spinal nerve. And once you get on the other side of the intervertebral foramen, the spinal nerve splits into 2 divisions, one that's small and one that is larger. The small division is the dorsal ramus. That is going to turn posteriorly and innervate structures associated with the posterior midline. Okay, so muscles that would be right here by the spinous process and the skin of the midline of the back. Okay, the ventral ramus is going to have axons that will go out to some location in the periphery that's another location not at the posterior midline. So it could be the anterior surface, it could be the lateral surface, it could be in one of your limbs, but it depends on which level of the cord you're looking at. Okay, so ventral rami form most of the axons that are associated with the nerves of our body. Okay, now one other point I want to make, remember how we talked about dorsal root was sensory only, ventral root was motor only. Once you get to the spinal nerve, you've mixed your sensory axons and your motor axons. Okay, now what that means is that if you cut this open and looked at the axons, there would be some axons in the spinal nerve that would be carrying impulses into the spinal cord. There would be others that would be transmitting impulses away. Okay, so we don't have a pure sensory or pure motor modality anymore. This is what we refer to as a mixed nerve. And the dorsal ramus and ventral ramus are both mixed nerves because they contain both axons carrying sensory information and other axons carrying motor information. Okay, let's switch over to this model. This is pretty similar. Okay, let's just go through the components again. Dorsal or posterior funiculus, lateral funiculus, anterior or ventral funiculus. Dorsal horn, ventral horn. Gray commissure, central canal. Dorsal root with dorsal root ganglion, ventral root, spinal nerve. Okay, there's no rami on this particular specimen. Okay, now as we come to the last model, this is the only one that has a lateral horn on it. Okay, and you can see, let's look at the gray matter over here because I think it's a little easier to see than this extended portion. Here's the posterior funiculus again, lateral funiculus, anterior funiculus, dorsal horn. Again, see how close it is to the surface? You can always tell that. And you see there's a distinct bump pointing laterally. That's the lateral horn. And then the one pointing anteriorly is the ventral horn or anterior horn. Okay? And again, you have dorsal root ganglion, ventral root, spinal nerve. This used to have dorsal ramus here, but it's been broken off, so it's not as useful for that any longer.